The varied train of hopes and fears which belonged to the situation of the prisoner and his faithful young companion stood for some time suspended. In some sort, they might be said neither to hope nor fear, for reasoning calmly, they neither expected that the worst would befall, and the actual and impending evil was certain. Like shipwrecked sailors who have betaken themselves to a boat and are tossed upon a tempestuous sea, they saw a ship nearing. They believed that their signal was seen and that it was bearing down towards them. What if, with sudden tack, the disdainful vessel should turn its prow aside and leave them to the mercy of the waves? They did not anticipate such a completion to their disasters. Yet as time passed, new anxieties occurred. Falkner's solicitor, Mr. Colville, had dispatched an agent to America to bring Osborne over. The pardon promised ensured his coming, and yet it was impossible not to feel inquietude with regard to his arrival. Falkner experienced least of this. He felt sure of Osborne, his creature, the being whose life he had heretofore saved, whose fortunes he had created. He knew his weakness, and how easily he was dealt with. The mere people of business were not so secure. Osborne enjoyed a comfortable existence, far from danger. Why should he come over to place himself in a disgraceful situation, to be branded as a pardoned felon? In 1,000 ways he might evade the summons. Perhaps there was nothing to prove that the Osborne whom Hoskins named was the Osborne who had been employed by Falkner and was deemed an accessory in Mrs. Neville's death. Hilary, who had been sent to Washington in September, had written immediately on his arrival. His passage had been tedious, as autumnal voyages to America usually are. He did not arrive till the last day of October. He announced that Osborne was in the town, and that, on the morrow, he should see him. This letter had arrived towards the end of November, and there was no reason wherefore Hilary and Osborne should not quickly follow it. But November passed away, and December had begun, and still the voyagers did not arrive. The southwest wind continued to reign with slight variation, except that as winter advanced it became more violent. Packets perpetually arrived in Liverpool from America after passages of 17 and 20 days, but Hilary did not return, nor did he write. The woods were despoiled of their leaves, but still the air was warm and pleasant, and it cheered Elizabeth as favorable to her hopes. The sun shone at intervals, and the misty mornings were replaced by cheerful days. Elizabeth rode out each morning, and this one day, the 16th of December, she found a new pleasure in her solitary exercise. The weather was calm and cheerful. A brisk canter gave speed to the current of her blood, and her thoughts, though busy, had a charm in them that she was half angry with herself for feeling, but which glowed all warm and bright, despite every effort. On the preceding evening, she had observed on her return home at 9 o'clock from the prison the figure of a man, which passed her hastily, and then stood aloof, as if guarding and watching her at a distance. Once, as he stood under an archway, a flickering lamp threw his shadow across her path. It was a bright moonlight night, and as he stood in the midst of an open space, near which her house was situated, she recognized, muffled as he was, the form of Gerard Neville. No wonder, then, that her heart was lightened of its burden. He had not forgotten her. He could no longer command himself to absence. If he might not converse with her, at least he might look upon her as she passed. On the same morning she entered her father's prison room. She found two visitors already there, Colville and his agent, Hilary. The faces of both were long and serious. Elizabeth turned anxiously to Falkner, who looked stern and disdainful. He smiled when he saw her and said, "You must not be shocked, my love, at the news which these gentlemen bring. I cannot tell how far it influences my fate, but it is impossible to believe that it is irrevocably sealed by it. But who can express the scorn that a man must feel to know that so abject a poltron wears the human form? Osborne refuses to come." Such an announcement naturally filled her with dismay. At the request of Falkner, Hilary began again to relate the circumstances of his visit to America. He recounted that finding that Osborne was in Washington, he lost no time in securing an interview. He delivered his letters to him and said that he came from Mr. Falkner on an affair of life and death. At the name, Osborne turned pale. He seemed afraid of opening the letters and muttered something about there being a mistake. At length he broke the seals. Fear, in its most abject guise, blanched his cheek as he read, and his hand trembled so that he could scarcely hold the paper. Hilary, perceiving at last that he had finished reading and was hesitating what to say, began himself to enter on the subject. when, faltering and stammering, Osborne threw the letter down, saying, "I said there was a mistake. I know nothing. All this affair is new to me. I never had concern with Mr. Falkner. I do not know who Mr. Falkner is." But for the pale, quivering lips of the man and his tremulous voice, Hilary might have thought that he spoke truth. But he saw that cowardice was the occasion of the lie he told, and he endeavored to set before him the perfect safety with which he might comply with the request he conveyed. But the more he said, Osborne, gathering assurance, the more obstinately denied all knowledge of the transactions in question or their principal actor. He changed, warmed by his own words, from timid to impudent in his denials, till Hilary's conviction began to be shaken a little, and at the same time he grew angry and cross-questioned him with a lawyer's art about his arrival in America, questions which Osborne answered with evident trepidation. At last he asked him if he remembered such and such a house and such a journey and the name of his companion on the occasion, and if he recollected a person of the name of Hoskins. Osborne started at the word as if he had been shot. Pale he was before, but now his cheeks grew of a chalky white, his limbs refused to support him, and his voice died away, till, rousing himself, he pretended to fly into a violent passion at the insolence of the intrusion and impertinence of the questions. As he spoke, he unwarily betrayed that he knew more of the transaction than he would willingly have allowed. At last, after running on angrily and incoherently for some time, he suddenly broke away, and they were at a tavern, left the room, and also the house. Hilary hoped that, on deliberation, he would come to his senses. He sent the letters after him to his house and called the next day, but he was gone. He had left Washington the evening before by the steamer to Charlestown. Hilary knew not what to do. He applied to the government authorities. They could afford him no help. He also repaired to Charlestown. Some time he spent in searching for Osborne vainly. It appeared plain that he traveled under another name. At length, by chance, he found a person who knew him personally, who said that he had departed a week before for New Orleans. It seemed useless to make this further journey, yet Hilary made it, and with like ill success. Whether Osborne was concealed in that town, whether he had gone to Mexico or lurked in the neighboring country, could not be discovered. Time wore away in fruitless researches, and it became necessary to come to a decision. Hopeless of success, Hilary thought it best to return to England with the account of his failure, so that no time might be lost in providing a remedy, if any could be found, to so fatal an injury to their cause. While this tale was being told, Falkner had leisure to recover from that boiling of the blood which the first apprehension of unworthy conduct in one of our fellow creatures is apt to excite, and now spoke with his usual composure. "I cannot believe," he said, "that this man's evidence is of the import which is supposed. No one, in fact, believes that I am a murderer. Everyone knows that I am innocent. All that we have to do is to prove this in a sort of technical and legal manner, and yet hardly that, for we are not to address the deaf ear of law, but the common sense of 12 men who will not be slow, I feel assured, in recognizing the truth. All that can be done to make my story plain, and to prove it by circumstances, of course must be done, and I do not fear but that, when it is ingenuously and simply told, it will suffice for my acquittal." "It is right to hope for the best," said Mr. Colville, "but Osborne's refusal to come is, in itself, a bad fact. The prosecutor will insist much upon it. I would give £100 to have him here." "I would not give 100 pence, said Falkner dryly. The other stared. The observation had an evil effect on his mind. He fancied that his client was even glad that a witness so material refused to appear, and this to him had the aspect of guilt. He continued, "I am so far of a different opinion that I should advise sending a second time. Had you a friend sufficiently zealous to undertake a voyage across the Atlantic for the purpose of persuading Osborne?" "I would not ask him to cross a ditch for the purpose," interrupted Falkner with some asperity. "Let such men as would believe a dastard like Osborne in preference to a gentleman and a soldier take my life if they will. It is not worth this pains in my own eyes, and thirsted for by my fellow-men, it is a burden I would willingly lay down." The soft touch of Elizabeth's hand placed on his recalled him. He looked on her tearful eyes and became aware of his fault. He smiled to comfort her. "I ought to apologize to these gentlemen for my hastiness," he said, "and to you, my dear girl, for my apparent trifling, but there is a degradation in these details that might chafe a more placid temper. I will not descend to beg my life. I am innocent. This all men must know, or at least will know, when their passions are no longer in excitement against me. I can say no more. I cannot win an angel from heaven to avouch my guiltlessness of her blood. I cannot draw this miserable fellow from his cherished refuge. All must fall on my own shoulders. I must support the burden of my fate. I shall appear before my judges. If they, seeing me and hearing me speak, yet pronounce me guilty, let them look to it. I shall be satisfied to die, so to quit at once a blind, bloodthirsty world. The dignity of Falkner as he spoke these words, the high, disdainful, yet magnanimous expression of his features, the clear though impassioned tone of his voice, thrilled the hearts of all. "Thank God, I do love this man even as he deserves to be loved," was the tender sentiment that lighted up Elizabeth's eyes, while his male auditors could not help, both by countenance and voice, giving token that they were deeply moved. On taking their leave soon after, Mr. Colville grasped Falkner's hand cordially and bade him rest assured that his zeal, his utmost endeavors should not be wanting to serve him. And, he added, in obedience rather to his newly awakened interest than his judgment, I cannot doubt but that our endeavors will be crowned with complete success. A man of real courage always finds new strength unfold within him to meet a larger demand made upon it. Falkner was now, perhaps, for the first time, thoroughly roused to meet the evils of his lot. He threw off every natural, every morbid sensibility, and strung himself at once to a higher and firmer tone of mind. He renounced the brittle hopes before held out to him, of this or that circumstance being in his favor. He entrusted unreservedly his whole cause to the mighty irresistible power who rules human affairs, and felt calm and free. If by disgrace and death he were to atone for the destruction of his victim, so let it be. The hour of suffering would come, and it would pass away, and leaving him a corpse, the vengeance of his fellow creatures would end there. He felt that the decree for life or death having received already the irrefragable fiat, he was prepared for both, and he resolved from that hour to drive all weak emotions, all struggle, all hope or fear from his soul. Let God's will be done. Something of Christian resignation, something derived from his Eastern life of belief in fatality, and something of philosophical fortitude, composed the feeling that engraved this sentiment in his heart in ineffaceable characters. He now spoke of Osborne to Elizabeth without acrimony. My indignation against that man was all thrown away, he said. We do not rebuke the elements when they destroy us, and why should we spend our anger against men? A word from Osborne, they say, would save me. The falling of the wind or the allaying of the waves would have saved either. Both are beyond our control. I imagined in those days that I could guide events, till suddenly the reins were torn from my hands. A few months ago I exulted, in expectation that the penalty demanded for my crime would be the falling by the hands of her son, and here I am an imprisoned felon. And now we fancy that this thing or that might preserve me, while in truth all is decreed, all registered, and we must patiently await the appointed time. Come what may, I am prepared. From this hour I have taught my spirit to bend, and to be content to die. When all is over, men will do me justice, and that poor fellow will bitterly lament his cowardice. It will be agony to him to remember that one word would have preserved my life then, when no power on earth can recall me to existence. He is not a bad man, and could he now have represented to him his after remorse, he would cease to exhibit such lamentable cowardice, a cowardice, after all, that has its origin in the remnants of good feeling. The fear of shame, horror at having participated in so fearful a tragedy, and a desire to throw off the consequences of his actions, which is the perpetual and stinging accompaniment of guilt, form his motives. But could he be told how immeasurably his sense of guilt will be increased if his silence occasions my death? All these would become minor considerations and vanish on the instant. And would it be impossible, said Elizabeth, to awaken this feeling in him? By no means, replied Falkner, though it is out of our power. We sent a mercenary, not indeed altogether lukewarm, but still not penetrated by that ardor, nor capable of that eloquence, which is necessary to move a weak man like the one he had to deal with. Osborne is, in some sort, a villain, but he is too feeble-minded to follow out his vocation. He always desired to be honest. Now he has the reputation of being such, from being one of those miserable creatures, the refuse of civilization, preying upon the vices, while they are the outcasts of society. He has become respectable and trustworthy in the eyes of others. He very naturally clings to advantages dearly earned, lately gained. He fancies to preserve them by deserting me. Could the veil be lifted, could the conviction be imparted of the wretch he will become in his own eyes, and of the universal execration that will be heaped on him after my death, his mind would entirely change, and he would be as eager, I had almost said, to come forward, as now he is set upon concealment and silence. Chapter 44. Elizabeth listened in silence. All that had passed made a deep impression from the moment that the solicitor had expressed a wish that Falkner had a zealous friend to cross the Atlantic, till now that he himself dilated on the good that would result from representations being clearly and fervently made to Osborne. She was revolving an idea that absorbed her whole faculties. This idea was no other than going to America herself. She had no doubt that, seeing Osborne, she could persuade him, and the difficulties of the journey appeared slight to her who had traveled so much. She asked Falkner many questions, and his answers confirmed her more and more in her plan. No objection presented itself to her mind. Already she felt sure of success. There was scarcely time, it was true, for the voyage, but she hoped that the trial might be again deferred if reasonable hopes were held out of Osborne's ultimate arrival. It was painful to leave Falkner without a friend, but the object of her journey was paramount even to this consideration. But it should be undertaken. Still, she said nothing of her scheme, and Falkner could not guess at what was passing in her mind. Wrapped in the reverie suggested by such a plan, she returned home in the evening, without thinking of the apparition of Neville, which had so filled her mind in the morning. It was not till at her own door that the thought glanced through her mind, and she remembered that she had seen nothing of him. She looked across the open space where he had stood the evening before. It was entirely vacant. She felt disappointed and saddened, and she began to reflect on her total friendlessness, no one to aid her in preparations for her voyage, none to advise. Her sole resource was in hirelings. But her independent, firm spirit quickly threw off this weakness, and she began a note to Mr. Colville, asking him to call on her, as she wished to arrange everything definitively before she spoke to Falkner. As she wrote, she heard a rapid, decided step in her quiet street, followed by a hurried yet gentle knock at her door. She started up. "It is he." The words were on her lips. When Gerard entered, she held out her hand, gladness thrilling through her whole frame, her heart throbbing wildly, her eyes lighted up with joy. "This is indeed kind," she cried. "Oh, Mr. Neville, how happy your visit makes me." He did not look happy. He had grown paler and thinner, and the melancholy which had sat on his countenance before, banished for a time by her, had returned, with the addition of a look of wildness that reminded her of the youth of Baden. Elizabeth was shocked to remark these traces of suffering, and her next impulse was to ask, "What has happened? I fear some new misfortune has occurred." "It is the property of misfortune to be ever new," he replied, "to be always producing fresh and more miserable results. I have no right to press my feelings on you. Your burden is sufficient, but I could not refrain any longer from seeing in what way adversity had exerted its pernicious influence over you." His manner was gloomy and agitated. She, resigned, devoted to her duties, commanding herself, day by day, to fulfill her task of patience and of acquiring cheerfulness for Falkner's sake. She imagined that some fresh disaster must be the occasion of these marks of emotion. She did not know that fruitless struggles to alleviate the evils of her situation, vain broodings over its horrors, and bitter regret at losing her, had robbed him of sleep, of appetite, of all repose. "I despise myself for my weakness," he said, "when I see your fortitude. You are more than woman, more than human being ever was, and you must feel the utmost contempt for one whom fortune bends and breaks as it does me. You are well, however, and half my dreams of misery have been false and vain. God guards and preserves you. I ought to have placed more faith in him. But tell me, dear Mr. Neville, tell me, what has happened?" "Nothing," he replied, "and does not that imply the worst? I cannot make up my mind to endure the visitation of ill fallen upon us. It drives me from place to place like an unlaid ghost. I am very selfish to speak in this manner. Yet it is your sufferings that fill my mind to bursting, were all the evil poured on my own head. While you were spared, welcome, most welcome would be the bitterest infliction. But you, Elizabeth, you are my cruel father's victim, and the future will be more hideous than the hideous present. Elizabeth was shocked and surprised. What could he mean? The future, she replied, will bring my dear father's liberation. How then can that be so bad? He looked earnestly and inquiringly on her. Yes, she continued, my sorrows, heavy as they are, have not that additional pang. I have no doubt of the ultimate justice that will be rendered my father. We have much to endure in the interim, much that undermines the fortitude and visits the heart with sickening throes. There is no help but patience. Let us have patience, and this adversity will pass away. The prison and the trial will be over, and freedom and security again be ours. I see how it is, replied Neville. We each live in a world of our own, and it is wicked in me to give you a glimpse of the scene as it is presented to me. Yet speak, explain, said Elizabeth. You have frightened me so much that any explanation must be better than the thoughts which your words, your manner, suggest. Nay, said Neville, do not let my follies infect you. Your views, your hopes are doubtless founded on reason. It is, if you will forgive the allusion that may seem too light for so sad a subject, but the old story of the silver and brazen shield. I see the dark, the fearful side of things. I live among your enemies, that is, the enemies of Mr. Falkner. I hear of nothing but his guilt, and the expiation prepared for it. I am maddened by all I hear. I have implored my father not to pursue his vengeance. Convinced, as I am of the truth of Mr. Falkner's narration, the idea that one so gifted should be made over to the fate that awaits him is abhorrent, and when I think that you are involved in such a scene of wrong and horror, my blood freezes in my veins. I have implored my father, I have quarreled with him, I have made Sophia advocate the cause of justice against malice, all in vain. Could you see the old man, my father I mean, pardon my irreverence, how he revels in the demoniacal hope of revenge, and with what hideous delight he gloats upon the detail of ignominy to be inflicted on one so much his superior in every noble quality, you would feel the loathing I do. He heaps sarcasm and contempt on my feeble spirit, as he names my pardon of my mother's destroyer, my esteem for him, and my sympathy for you, but that does not touch me. It is the knowledge that he will succeed, and you be lost and miserable forever, that drives me to desperation. I fancied that these thoughts must pursue you even more painfully than they do me. I saw you writhing beneath the tortures of despair, wasting away under the influence of intense misery. You haunted my dreams, accompanied by every image of horror. Sometimes you were bleeding, ghastly, dying. Sometimes you took my poor mother's form, as Falkner describes it, snatched cold and pale from the waves. Other visions flitted by, still more frightful. Despairing of moving my father, abhorring the society of every human being, I have been living for the last month at Dramore. A few days ago my father arrived there. I wondered till I heard the cause. The time for expecting Osborne had arrived. As vultures have instinct for carrion, so he swooped down at the far-off scent of evil fortune. He had an emissary at Liverpool, on the watch to hear of this man's arrival. Disgusted at this foul appetite for evil, I left him. I came here, only to see you, to gaze on you afar, was to purify the world of the blasts from hell, which the bad passions I have so long contemplated spread round me. My father learned whither I had gone. I had a letter from him this morning. You may guess at its contents. He triumphs in Osborne's refusal to appear, said Elizabeth, who was much moved by the picture of hatred and malice Neville had presented to her, and trembled from head to foot as she listened, from the violent emotions his account excited and the vehemence of his manner as he spoke. He does indeed triumph, replied Neville, and you and Mr. Falkner, do you not despair? If you could see my dear father, said Elizabeth, her courage returning at the thought, you would see how innocence and a noble mind can sustain. At the worst, he does not despair. He bears the present with fortitude, he looks to the future with resignation. His soul is firm, his spirit inflexible. And you share these feelings? Partly I do, and partly I have other thoughts to support me. Osborne's cowardice is a grievous blow, but it must be remedied. The man we sent to bring him was too easily discouraged. Other means must be tried. I shall go to America, I shall see Osborne, and you cannot doubt of my success." "You," cried Neville, "you to go to America, you to follow the traces of a man who hides himself. Impossible. This is worse madness than all. Does Falkner consent to so senseless an expedition?" "You use strong expressions," interrupted Elizabeth. "I do," he replied, "and I have a right to do so. I beg your pardon. But my meaning is justifiable. You must not undertake this voyage. It is as useless as improper. Suppose yourself arrived on the shores of wide America. You seek a man who conceals himself you know not where. Can you perambulate large cities, cross wide extensive country, go from town to town in search of him? It is by personal exertion alone that he can be found, and your age and sex wholly prevent that." "Yet I shall go," said Elizabeth thoughtfully. "So much is left undone, because we fancy it impossible to do, which, upon endeavor, is found plain and easy. If insurmountable obstacles oppose themselves, I must submit, but I see none yet. I have not the common fears of a person whose life has been spent in one spot. I have been a traveler, and know that, but for the fatigue, it is as easy to go 1,000 miles as 100. If there are dangers and difficulties, they will appear light to me, encountered for my dear father's sake." She looked beautiful as an angel as she spoke. Her independent spirit had nothing rough in its texture. It did not arise from a love of opposition, but from a belief that, in fulfilling a duty, she could not be opposed or injured. Her fearlessness was that of a generous heart that could not believe in evil intentions. She explained more fully to her friend the reasons that induced her determination. She repeated Falkner's account of Osborne's character, the injury that it was believed would arise from his refusal to appear, and the probable facility of persuading him were he addressed by one zealous in the cause. Neville listened attentively. She paused, he was lost in thought, and made no reply. She continued to speak, but he continued mute, till at last she said, "You are conquered, I know you yield, and agree that my journey is a duty, a necessity." "We are both apt, it would seem," he replied, "to see our duties in a strong light, and to make sudden, or they may be called rash, resolutions. Perhaps we both go too far, and are in consequence reprehended by those about us. In each other, then, let us find approval. You must not go to America, for your going would be useless. With all your zeal you could not succeed. But I will go. Of course this act will be treated as madness, or worse, by Sir Boyvill and the rest, but my own mind assures me that I do right. For many years I devoted myself to discovering my mother's fate. I have discovered it. Falkner's narrative tells all, but clear and satisfactory as that is to me, others choose to cast frightful doubts over its truth and conjure up images the most revolting. Have they any foundation? I do not believe it, but many do, and all assert that the approaching trial alone can establish the truth. This trial is but a mockery, unless it is fair and complete. It cannot be that without Osborne. Surely, then, it neither misbecomes me as her son, nor as the son of Sir Boyvill, to undertake any action that will tend to clear up the mystery. I am resolved. I shall go, be assured that I shall not return without Osborne. You will allow me to take your place, to act for you. You do not distrust my zeal." Elizabeth had regarded her own resolves as the simple dictates of reason and duty, but her heart was deeply touched by Neville's offer. Tears rushed into her eyes as she replied, in a voice faltering with emotion, "I fear this cannot be. It will meet with too much opposition. But never, never can I repay your generosity in, but imagining so great a service." "It is a service to both," he said, "and as to the opposition I shall meet, that is my affair. You know that nothing will stop me when once resolved, and I am resolved. The inner voice that cannot be mistaken assures me that I do right. I ask no other approval. A sense of justice, perhaps of compassion, for the original author of all our wretchedness, ought probably to move me, but I will not pretend to be better than I am. Were Falkner alone concerned, I fear I should be lukewarm. But not one cloud, nor the shadow of a cloud, shall rest on my mother's fate. All shall be clear, all universally acknowledged, nor shall your life be blotted and your heart broken by the wretched fate of him to whom you cling with matchless fidelity. He is innocent, I know, but if the world thinks and acts by him as a murderer, how could you look up again? Through you I succeeded in my task. To you I owe unspeakable gratitude, which it is my duty to repay. Yet, away with such expressions. You know that my desire to serve you is boundless, that I love you beyond expression, that every injury you receive is trebled upon me, that vain were every effort of self-command. I must do that thing that would benefit you, though the whole world rose to forbid. You are of more worth in your innocence and nobleness than a nation of men such as my father. Do you think I can hesitate in my determinations thus founded, thus impelled? More vehement, more impassioned than Elizabeth, Neville bore down her objections, while he awakened all her tenderness and gratitude. Now I prove myself your friend, he said proudly. Now heaven affords me opportunity to serve you, and I thank it. He looked so happy, so wildly delighted, while a more still but not less earnest sense of joy filled her heart. They were young, and they loved. This of itself was bliss. But the cruel circumstances around them added to their happiness by drawing them closer together and giving fervor and confidence to their attachment. And now that he saw a mode of serving her, and she felt entire reliance on his efforts, the last veil and barrier fell from between them, and their hearts became united by that perfect love which can result alone from entire confidence and acknowledged unshackled sympathy. Always actuated by generous impulses, but often rash in his determinations and impetuous in their fulfillment, full of the warmest sensibility, hating that the meanest thing that breathed should endure pain, and feeling the most poignant sympathy for all suffering, Neville had been maddened by his own thoughts, while he brooded over the position in which Elizabeth was placed. Not one of those various circumstances that alleviate disaster to those who endure it presented themselves to his imagination. He saw adversity in its most hideous form, without relief or disguise, names and images appending to Falkner's frightful lot, which he and Elizabeth carefully banished from their thoughts, haunted him. The fate of the basest felon hung over the prisoner. Neville believed that it must inevitably fall on him. He often wondered that he did not contrive to escape, that Elizabeth, devoted and heroic, did not contrive some means of throwing open his dungeon's doors. He had endeavored to open his father's eyes, to soften his heart, in vain. He had exerted himself to discover whether any trace of long-past circumstances existed that might tend to acquit Falkner. He had gone to Treby, visited the graves of the hapless parents of Elizabeth, seen Mrs. Baker, and gathered there the account of his landing, but nothing helped to elucidate the mystery of his mother's death. Falkner's own account was the only trace left behind, that bore the stamp of truth in every line, and appeared to him so honorable a tribute to poor Elizabeth's memory, that he looked with disgust on his father's endeavors to cast upon it suspicions and interpretations the most hideous and appalling. In the first instance, he had been bewildered by Sir Boyvill's sophistry and half conquered by his plausible arguments. But a short time, and the very circumstance of Elizabeth's fidelity to his cause sufficed to show him the baseness of his motives and the real injury he did his mother's fame. Resolved to clear the minds of other men from the prejudice against the prisoner thus spread abroad, and at least to secure a fair trial, Neville made no secret of his belief that Falkner was innocent. He represented him everywhere as a gentleman, a man of humanity and honor, whose crime ought to receive its punishment from his own conscience, and at the hand of the husband or son of the victim in the field, and whom, to pursue as his father did, was at once futile and disgraceful. Sir Boyville, irritated by Falkner's narrative, his vanity wounded to the quick by the avowed indifference of his wife, was enraged beyond all bounds by the opposition of his son. Unable to understand his generous nature, and relying on his previous zeal for his mother's cause, he had not doubted but that his revenge would find a ready ally in him. His present arguments, his esteem for their enemy, his desire that he should be treated with a forbearance which, between gentlemen, was but an adherence to the code of honor, appeared to Sir Boyville insanity, and worse, a weakness the most despicable, a want of resentment the most low-minded. But he cared not. The game was in his hands. Reveling in the idea of his enemy's ignominious sufferings, he more than half persuaded himself that his accusation was true, and that the punishment of a convicted felon would at last satisfy his thirst for revenge. A feeble old man, tottering on the verge of the grave, he gloried to think that his grasp was still deadly, his power acknowledged in throes of agony by him by whom he had been injured. Returning to Dromore from Carlisle, Gerard sought his father. Osborne's refusal to appear crowned Sir Boyvill's utmost hopes, and his sarcastic congratulations when he saw his son expressed all the malice of his heart. Gerard replied with composure that he did indeed fear that this circumstance would prove fatal to the course of justice, but that it must not tamely be submitted to, and that he himself was going to America to induce Osborne to come, that nothing might be wanting to elucidate the mystery of his mother's fate, and to render the coming trial full, fair, and satisfactory. Such an announcement rendered, for a moment, Sir Boyville speechless with rage. A violent scene ensued. Gerard, resolved and satisfied of the propriety of his resolution, was calm and firm. Sir Boyville, habituated to the use of vituperative expressions, boiled over with angry denunciations and epithets of abuse. He called his son the disgrace of his family, the opprobrium of mankind, the detractor of his mother's fame. Gerard smiled, yet, at heart, he deeply felt the misery of thus forever finding an opponent in his father, and it required all the enthusiasm and passion of his nature to banish the humiliating and saddening influence of Sir Boyville's indignation. They parted worse friends than ever. Sir Boyville set out for town, Gerard repaired to Liverpool. The wind was contrary, there was little hope of change. He thought that it would conduce to his success in America if he spent the necessary interval in seeing Hoskins again, and also in consulting with his friend, the American minister. So, in all haste, having first secured his passage on board a vessel that was to sail in 4 or 5 days, he also set out for London. Chapter 45. The philosophy of Falkner was not proof against the intelligence that Gerard Neville was about to undertake the voyage to America for the sake of inducing Osborne to come over. Elizabeth acquainted him with her design and her friend's determination to replace her, with sparkling eyes and cheeks flushed by the agitation of pleasure, the pure pleasure of having such proof of the worth of him she loved. Falkner was even more deeply touched, even though he felt humiliated by the very generosity that filled him with admiration. His blood was stirred, and his feelings tortured him by a sense of his own demerits and the excellence of one he had injured. "Better die without a word than purchase my life thus," were the words hovering on his lips, yet it was no base cost that he paid, and he could only rejoice at the virtues of the son of her whom he had so passionately loved. There are moments when the past is remembered with intolerable agony, and when to alter events, which occurred at the distance of many years, becomes a passion and a thirst. His regret at Aletha's marriage seemed all renewed, his agony that thenceforth she was not to be the half of his existence as he had hoped, that her child was not his child, that her daily life, her present pleasures and future hopes were divorced from his. All these feelings were revived, together with a burning jealousy, as if, instead of being a buried corpse, she had still adorned her home with her loveliness and virtues. Such thoughts lost their poignancy by degrees, and he could charm Elizabeth by dwelling on Gerard's praises, and he remarked with pleasure that she resumed her vivacity and recovered the color and elasticity of motion which she had lost. She did not feel less for Falkner, but her contemplations had lost their somber hue. They were full of Neville, his voyage, his exertions, his success, his return, and the spirit of love that animated each of these acts were gone over and over again in her waking dreams. Unbidden smiles gleamed in her countenance. Her ideas were gaily colored, and her conversation gained a variety and cheerfulness that lightened the burden of their prison hours. Meanwhile Neville arrived in London. He visited the American minister and learned from him that Osborne had given up the place he held and had left Washington. No one knew whither he was gone, these events being still too recent to leave any trace behind. It was evident that to seek and find him would be a work of trouble and time, and Neville felt that not a moment must be lost. December was drawing to a close. The voyages to and from America might, if not favorable, consume the whole interval that still remained before the spring assizes. Hoskins, he learned, was gone to Liverpool. He visited Lady Cecil before he left town. Though somewhat tainted by worldliness, yet this very feeling made her highly disapprove Sir Boyville's conduct. A plausible, and she believed, true account was given of Mrs. Neville's death, exonerating her, redounding indeed to her honor. It was injurious to all to cast doubts upon this tale. It was vulgar and base to pursue revenge with such malicious and cruel pertinacity. Falkner was a gentleman and deserved to be treated as such, and now he and Elizabeth were mixed up in loathsome scenes and details that made Lady Cecil shudder even to think of. That Gerard should go to America as the advocate, as it were, of Falkner startled her, but he represented his voyage in a simpler light, as not being undertaken for his benefit, but for the sake of justice and truth. Sir Boyvill came in upon them while they were discussing this measure. He was absolutely frenzied by his son's conduct and views. His exasperation but tended to disgust, and did not operate to shake their opinions. Neville hastened back to Liverpool. A southwest wind reigned, whose violence prevented any vessel from sailing for America. It was evident that the passage would be long and perhaps hazardous. Neville thought only of the delay, but this made him anxious. A portion of his time was spent in seeking for Hoskins, but he was not to be found. At last it was notified to him that the wind had a little changed, and that the packet was about to sail. He hurried on board. Soon they were tossing on a tempestuous sea. They lost sight of land, sky and ocean, each dusky, and the one rising at each moment into more tumultuous commotion, surrounded them. Neville, supporting himself by a rope, looked out over the horizon. A few months before he had anticipated the same voyage over a summer sea. Now he went under far other auspices. The veil was raised, the mystery explained, but the wintry storms that had gathered round him were but types of the tempestuous passions which the discoveries he had made raised in the hearts of all. For 3 days and nights, the vessel beat about in the Irish Channel, unable to make any way. 3 days were thus lost to their voyage, and when were they to arrive? Impatient, almost terrified by the delay which attended his endeavors, Neville began to despair of success. On the 4th night the gale rose to a hurricane. There was no choice but to run before it. By noon the following day, the captain thought himself very lucky to make the harbour of Liverpool, and though the gale had much abated, and the wind had veered into a more favourable quarter, it was necessary to run in to refit. With bitter feelings of disappointment, Neville disembarked. Several days must elapse before the packet would be able to put to sea, so he abandoned the idea of going by her, and finding a New York merchantman preparing to sail at an early hour the following morning, he resolved to take his passage on board. He hastened to the American coffee house to see the captain and make the necessary arrangements for his voyage. The captain had just left the tavern, but a waiter came up to Neville and told him that the Mr. Hoskins, concerning whom he had before inquired, was in the house, in a private room. "Show me to him," said Neville, and followed the man as he went to announce him. Hoskins was not alone. He had a friend with him, and they were seated over their wine on each side of the fire. Neville could not help being struck with the confusion evinced by both as he entered. The person with Hoskins was a fair, light-haired, rather good-looking man. Though past the prime of life, he had at once an expression of good nature and cunning in his face, and added to this a timid, baffled look, which grew into something very like dismay when the waiter announced Mr. Neville. "Good morning, sir," said Hoskins. "I hear that you have been inquiring for me. I thought all our business was settled." "On your side, probably," replied Neville. "On mine, I have reasons for wishing to see you. I have been seeking you in vain in London and here." "Yes, I know," said the other. "I went round by Ravinglas to take leave of the old woman before I crossed, and here I am, my passage taken, with not an hour to lose. I sail by the Awahi, Captain Bateman." "Then we shall have time enough for all my inquiries," observed Neville. "I came here for the very purpose of arranging my passage with Captain Bateman." "You, sir, are you going to America? I thought that was all at an end." "It is more necessary than ever. I must see Osborne. I must bring him over. His testimony is necessary to clear up the mystery that hangs over my mother's fate." "You are nearer hanging Mr. Falkner without him than with him," said Hoskins. "I would bring him over for the very purpose of saving a man whom I believe to be innocent of the crime he is charged with. For that purpose, I go to America. I wish the truth to be established. I have no desire for revenge." "And do you really go to America for that purpose?" repeated Hoskins. "Certainly I consider it my duty," replied Neville. "Nay, it may be said that I went for this design, for I sailed by the John Adams, which has been driven back by contrary winds. I disembarked only half an hour ago." "That beats all," cried Hoskins. "Why, do you know, I have more than half a mind to tell you, you had really sailed for America for the purpose of bringing Osborne over, and you now intend taking a passage on board the Awahi." "Certainly, why not? What is there so strange in all this? I sought you for the sake of making inquiries that might guide me in my search for Osborne, who wishes to conceal himself." "You could not have addressed a better man, by the Lord. He's a craven and deserves no better, so I'll just let out, Mr. Neville, that Osborne sneaked out of this room at the instant he saw you come into it."